At my father's funeral, George indulged his unattainable love in setting up a gambling ring. People were laughing and joking, betting that I would take advantage of the situation to play the victim, and George couldn't shake me off. At that moment, my heart turned to ashes. I quietly removed all valuable items from my body and called over a nearby waiter. "There's a chance to make a fortune, would you like it? I'm tired of gambling with Julie, thinking of getting a new dog." The waiter won the bet, and after dividing the money, I smoothly disappeared from George's life. Initially, George didn't care. Bankrupt, father's dead, she won't stay aloof for long without anyone backing her up. Days passed, then months, and 3 months later, still no word from me. George panicked. He found me at a banquet, first instructing others to insult me, then trying to lure me himself. "Julie, soften up, I've got you covered." When I was left isolated and helpless, the waiter raised a glass to me from the main seat. "Thanks to you, I've really made a fortune. Do you want a chance to be a bully?" Chapter 1. At the memorial reception after the funeral, George's stepsister in unattainable love showed up uninvited. She was wearing a bright red spaghetti strap dress, cheerfully setting up a gambling table at George's table. "Come on, it's been a while since we played, let's all bet. Julie, that annoying ghost's father is dead, she's definitely going to play the victim, let's bet on whether my brother can get rid of her." The atmosphere was lively, with many people placing their bets. And I was Julie. Just then, I had finished settling the banquet fees and was about to return to get my coat. The absurd scene made me tremble uncontrollably. I leaned against a pillar, subconsciously searching for George's figure. However, the man I had grown up with was now watching his stepsister with interest, allowing all this unreasonable and absurdity to happen. He said, "Just a mangy dog, whether he can get rid of it or not depends on what chips you're willing to put down." Michelle blushed under his direct gaze. But still, she pretended to be dumb and bet her dress. "This dress just arrived today, I'll bet it too." "Stingy. You can wear it if I win." The ambiguous teasing laughter around grew more unrestrained. "Oh, George can't wear it, but he can take it off." The entire hall of the condolence banquet was filled with lewd and vulgar laughter. George's assistant reminded him softly. "George, don't go too far, Julie won't take it well." George frowned displeased, acting as if he had never known me. "Bankrupt, father's dead, got it, she'll pretend not to know." I think my feelings for George were completely buried at that moment. In just a moment, I knew what I had to do. I suppressed the surging emotions and quietly removed all valuable items from my body. I called over the waiter with a duckbill cap next to me. "There's a chance to make a fortune, would you like it? Go to the table over there, bet that Julie is tired of playing and wants to change dogs." Chapter 2. Afraid the waiter might get stage fright, I explained the rules of the bet to him. To my surprise, the waiter I casually called over remained unusually calm. Under the gaze of the arrogant second-generation crowd, he walked slowly to the gambling table. Carefully placed the bet slip on the table. "Anyone can place a bet?" he asked. Michelle nodded. "Just a friendly reminder, the person involved is a tough one to shake off, think carefully before placing your bet." The waiter lowered his eyes without responding. Casually took off his wristwatch, threw it into my bet slip, and pushed it forward. "Word by word," he said. "I bet that Julie is tired of playing and wants to change dogs." An eerie silence fell over the surroundings instantly. George's hand, tapping on the table, stopped abruptly, and he slowly raised his head. Some had even prepared for a fight, but the waiter seemed as unaffected as if he couldn't sense the tension. Impatiently, someone shot a glance at George. "What? Are you that dog?" George was furious, his brows furrowed instantly. But before he could erupt, he turned abruptly as if struck by a sudden realization. Then, our eyes met. A long silence, neither of us spoke. Memories played out like a long shot in a movie, slowly passing through the old times. The figure waiting at the classroom door after school. The butterfly chasing us on the back of a bicycle. And the tiptoes raised under the willow branches, with the gentle and precious touch on the lips. One scene after another flashed by, then gradually faded away. George's throat moved, but he hesitated to speak. I lowered my gaze, turned, and went up on the stage. Sincerely thanked everyone. Then, in front of everyone, I called off the engagement with George. Chapter 3. The waiter won all the bets. Not a single person in the room bet that I would leave George. Even George himself didn't expect that one day I would leave him on my own accord. I told him I was bored, planning to switch to a new dog. He looked at me angrily and somewhat panicked, asking me if I had gone crazy. So I showed him just how crazy I could be. In front of everyone, I took out my phone and pressed the play button for the recording. The next moment, Michelle's mocking voice resounded loudly through the speakers. Stingy. The skirt arrived today, I bet it to you. I bet it to you, as if you can wear it. Hey, George can't wear it, but he can take it off. Many people gathered around. The lewd laughter echoed in the somber funeral hall, appearing absurd and pitiful. I adjusted the portrait of my father. Standing tall on the stage, I looked down at Michelle. As a beggar who doesn't follow the rules at the feast, I have won the right to take off this skirt from you. The recording is proof. According to the unwritten rules of the circle, bets must be settled outside the gambling table. Those who violate this will be completely shunned by the circle. So, I emphasized each word. Are you going to take it off yourself, or do I have to help you? Many onlookers who enjoyed a good show started live streaming. Michelle turned pale, tears instantly streaming down her face. Crying, she hid behind George. I stared at her coldly. If you don't want to take it off, then everyone who's been making a scene today must apologize to my father one by one. The situation became quite ugly. Michelle cried, both embarrassed and annoyed, pleading with those second-generation kids. But how could these proud second-generation kids lower themselves to apologize? They were all eager to see Michelle take it off right there. The surrounding whispers pushed Michelle to a complete breakdown. George stopped Michelle, tenderly pulling her close. Furrowing his brows, he shouted at me. Julie, is this really necessary? I promised to talk about the engagement later, it was just a playful bet. What are you doing? I stood there stubbornly, unmoved. As my father's portrait looked kindly at George, just as he had countless times before. After a long standoff where George couldn't handle me or the second-generation kids. Finally, an elder stepped in to mediate. At the end of the incident, George wrote a large check to compensate Michelle for her dress. The onlookers bowed and offered their apologies. No one kowtowed. The glaring red dress remained untouched. But this was the most dignified ending I could achieve. As I accepted George's check, Michelle glared at me with resentment. Brother, don't be angry, let's just consider this as paying off a beggar. This might be the last time she sees this much money in her life. George chuckled at the jewels, his tone mocking. Julie, all this trouble for a bunch of second-hand goods? Do you realize how many people you've offended with your childish behavior? I lowered my head to count the jewels I had won, not responding. Michelle was right. This might be the most money I could temporarily get, just enough for Grandma's surgery. The bowing second-generation kids passed by me, muttering curses under their breath as they left one by one. George, looking utterly disappointed, followed the second-generation kids and left. The crowd dispersed. The empty hall was a mess. I looked up, smiled, and asked the waiter who had been standing by my side all along, holding the jewels. How was that? Pretty impressive, right? The waiter's cap brim was pressed low, his expression unreadable. He gently tugged at the corner of his mouth and said, impressive. You're good with words, how about a 70/30th split? The waiter remained silent, handing me a few tissues to wipe my face. It was then that I realized I had been crying without even knowing it. Chapter 5. Putting on a facade of strength and indifference, I hastily wiped my face a couple of times. Selecting a few valuable but easily liquidated pieces of jewelry, I stuffed them into the waiter's hands. Take these, be generous, my friend. I didn't want him to see me as pitiful. However, my strong image didn't last a day. The next evening, when I was shamelessly crying in the hospital stairwell, the waiter caught me. Grandma had passed away. The surgery fee I had won was no longer needed. As I busied myself arranging the ashes, getting the necessary paperwork, and ensuring everything was in order, I finally broke down. I huddled in the corner of the stairs, crying like an unwanted stray dog. No, I am just an unwanted stray dog. Lost my loved ones. Home sealed off. As my tears ran down my mouth, the waiter, cigarette in hand, stood a few steps above me. He took off his cap, revealing a handsome yet intimidating face. A faint pink scar ran along the corner of his narrow eyes. My vulnerability exposed to him. The faint glow of the cigarette butt, flickering. I suppressed my sobs, sniffing. When I cleaned up the last bit of snot on my face, the waiter extinguished his cigarette. I can't find a place to exchange those jewels you gave me. Can you help me? I opened my mouth, stunned for a moment. Finally, I managed to find a casual tone. Sure, no problem. I think I must have forced a smile on my face. But after saying those words, everything went black, and I knew nothing. Chapter 6. I had low blood sugar and fell down the stairs. Later, upon careful recollection, it had been 3 days since I last ate. When I woke up again, I found myself in a strange room. Simple yet neat. A faint scent of soap on the pillow. For a moment, I felt a bit regretful. Why wake up at all? Following Dad and Grandma didn't seem so bad. But then, the vast sunlight, so gently spread across the narrow bed where I lay. It felt just like the home of my childhood. I sat up, peeled off the bandage on the back of my hand. Then I heard clinking noises coming from downstairs. Climbing to the window, I realized I was in a 2-story building. Below was an auto repair shop. The waiter, now in work pants, with his sturdy arms on display, was working on the door of an off-road vehicle. Glistening beads of sweat mischievously sneaked into his clothes under the sunlight. He seemed to sense something, propping himself against the car door and looking up. The sunlight was just right. So I awkwardly tugged at the corner of my mouth and joked. Since it's so hard, how about I take care of you? He didn't smile. Paused his actions, deep in thought. Then asked seriously. Big Eater, will you take care of me? Chapter 7. I chuckled speechlessly. Why so serious? But the person downstairs stubbornly held that pose, waiting for my response. The kitchen wafted the scent of food. My stomach growled twice. Unnamed wildflowers by the window swayed, revealing their buds in the breeze. At that moment, I suddenly felt that the world wasn't entirely devoid of amusement. So I sheepishly smiled. I only have the money I won that day, so you better not eat too much. Chapter 8. That day, I blocked all of George's contacts. Tried to immerse myself in a new life. Old acquaintances kept calling to persuade me. They said I should reconcile with George, for the sake of our long-standing relationship, he wouldn't just watch me fall. I silently blocked them all. I started running Kevin's auto repair shop. Kevin said he wasn't actually a waiter, he was just at the hotel for some business that day and happened to be stopped by me. He was actually a mechanic. After explaining, he earnestly asked me again. Dirty ones too, will you take care of them? I'll clean up immediately after work. In moments like these, I would think of the big yellow dog in Grandma's yard. Quiet, not much of a barker. Quite ferocious. But would devoutly rub against my pant leg. So without realizing it, I raised my hand and gently stroked his fur. The days of emptiness became long and tranquil. I exchanged all the jewels for money, giving Kevin's little second floor a fresh look. We got a small local dog in the yard. Hired 2 more mechanics. When Kevin was working, I would sit silently beside him, lost in thought. Or simply gaze at him intently. Bronze skin, sleek and defined muscles, tense with exertion. My heart would vividly beat during those tense moments. Sometimes Kevin would blush under my gaze. casually handing me a pair of sunglasses. Have you seen enough? I shook my head, tracing my fingers along his forearm. They are like little sprouts breaking through the soil. Just looking at them gives a bit of courage to keep going. Kevin stayed still. A look of what seemed like compassion flashed in his eyes. After that, he would intentionally ask me to help wipe off sweat. On his arms, forehead, waist, even on his abs. He would quietly check on me at midnight to see if I was sleeping. In the morning, he would tell me how great the sunlight was, how interesting life could be. I knew he was afraid I might do something reckless. I teased him intentionally. What's so interesting that I don't know about? He froze for a moment, his expression not too pleasant. Dropping his tools, he finished work early, pulling me into the room and locking the door behind him. As he approached, removing his gloves and tossing his outerwear, I was cornered on the edge of the bed. Nowhere to hide. He looked at me with a heavy gaze, bluntly asking, "Do you want to sleep with me?" Chapter 9. The pale red sunset cast a hazy, ambiguous light indoors. Kevin's silhouette had a fuzzy border, like a beautiful figure stepping out of a painting. Almost involuntarily, I asked, "Are you going to take responsibility?" So Kevin raised his hand, taking off his undershirt. "Try it out and then we'll see," he said arrogantly. Saying that, he took my hand and pressed it against his firm chest. And then, downwards. I ran my hand over his firm waist and abdomen, slowly stopping at the metal buckle of his belt. The sound of my heartbeat grew louder. A strong scent of hormones, dangerous and thrilling. My hands were trembling. Click. The buckle came undone. Kevin kissed me fiercely, his rough hands gripping my waist. Exploring, restraining, conquering. Numerous shivers, overwhelming pleasure making me rediscover the vibrancy of life. That night, Kevin pulled out all the stops, just to make things interesting for me. Chapter 10. The next morning, as the sunlight crawled up Kevin's back, his lazy voice came from the pillow. "Are you satisfied?" I guiltily averted my admiring gaze, my throat temporarily unable to make a sound. "Not satisfied?" His expression turned dark instantly. "It turns out, you shouldn't provoke a man's competitiveness so easily." After that day, I never had trouble sleeping again. Chapter 11. Those were shameless days. In the blink of an eye, over 40 days had passed. I gradually forgot the pain George had caused, but George, on the other hand, began searching for my whereabouts. I didn't know, but George started feeling uneasy on the day the morning feast ended. He was brought to the hotel by Michelle. Michelle tearfully recounted the fright at the feast, then coquettishly threw herself into his arms. She said, "This dress is now yours." George wasn't in the mood. Julie's stubborn face flashed through his mind. Someone who was usually so gentle and proud, acting so out of character. A pile of second-hand goods, acting like a precious treasure. George was immersed in a kind of inexplicable bitter emotion. He attributed it to anger. Seeing him unfazed, Michelle reluctantly took off the dress herself. "Take it back, but it's not enough for your check." "What should we do?" Poor lines. The inviting posture, however, seemed unusually skilled. George instantly felt irritated. Leaning back, legs open, indifferent. "Whatever, you figure it out." Without giving George a chance to hesitate, Michelle took the initiative. After venting, George calmed down. He reviewed the events of that night. He had already arranged for Julie to settle the bill and go back to rest when he heard Michelle was coming. It was her own choice to come back looking for trouble. Even if his words were indeed excessive at the time, she shouldn't have gone overboard. In any case, this time he would make her suffer a bit, to see the situation clearly. From now on, her spoiled temper wouldn't be so easily indulged. That night, he didn't sleep very soundly. He inexplicably dreamed of the Julie from his school days. Back then, she was very delicate. chasing after him passionately. But when her period came, she went on strike. She said, "Even if the heavens and the earth are vast, menstruation reigns supreme. When it comes, not even God can do anything." So for 3 days, he didn't see her shadow. Curious, he went to her classroom and found the young lady lounging at the back, wrapped in a blanket, with a hot water bottle and a hand warmer. Seeing him, she completely abandoned her usual arrogant attitude, bluntly ordering him around, asking him to pass her the water cup. She said she couldn't be bothered to bend down. For the first time, he saw this kind of girl, so quickly changing her demeanor. He passed her the cup, only to find it contained a specially made hot drink. Her family chauffeur had specially driven it to the school. Delivered twice a day, she wouldn't drink anything not freshly brewed. So he said, "You're so delicate, what if your family runs out of money?" She teasingly replied, "Will you support me then?" "I don't want you." He maintained his aloof persona. She responded lackadaisically, "If you don't want me, I'll go wander, scam some money from you, and then go wander." George woke up startled, frantically reaching for his phone. No messages from Julie. Realizing his panic, he smashed his phone. What's the point of being so proud? He didn't let her touch it before, this time he had to make her yield. He started taking Michelle out more prominently, even bringing her to Julie's grandmother's hospital checkup. However, he didn't run into Julie. Instead, he received the news of Julie's grandmother's passing. He was stunned. Quickly coming to his senses, he dialed Julie's number, only to realize he had been blocked. Chapter 12. Kevin's auto repair shop is by the roadside at the foot of the mountain. Far from the hustle and bustle, yet never dull. Watching the sunrise in the morning, making love at dusk. When I was feeling a bit better, Kevin started taking me into the mountains. Mushroom picking, catching wild chickens, barefoot by the stream, watching Kevin fish. Kevin rarely smiled. His white teeth and the beautiful curve of his mouth softened the sharpness in his eyes. "Why don't you smile more often?" I asked. Kevin paused for a moment, wading over to me in the water. "Will you stay here forever?" he asked. I smiled and rolled up his pant legs for him. "Other than here, I have nowhere else to go." I didn't notice the furrowed brow on Kevin's face. I never knew what special feelings he had for me. That afternoon, while Kevin was grilling fish outside the tent, I climbed up the nearby cliff alone. As I spread my arms to feel the wind, a sudden force pulled me back onto the boulder behind me. Kevin held me, eyes red with tears. Growling low, he bit down fiercely on my shoulder. His voice filled with regret and grievance. "You fucking seduced me first, tried it and then don't want to take responsibility." I was stunned for a moment before reacting belatedly. He thought I was going to jump off the cliff. After a moment of laughter, a sense of fullness filled my chest. I lifted his face in my hands. "The slope is so low, am I crazy enough to seek death here?" Kevin lifted his eyes in bewilderment, staring for a good while. For the first time, I saw an embarrassed expression on his face. It couldn't help but make me laugh. "Are you a dog? Your bite hurt so much." Kevin's face darkened again. He buried his head in my chest, through the clothes, and bit down again. His voice was muffled, "Isn't this what you said? Planning to switch to another dog?" I was trembling all over from his bite, my pained voice changing pitch. Kevin had no intention of stopping, igniting the fire all the way, continuing his actions in a vengeful manner. The hem of my skirt was pushed up to my waist. For the first time, Kevin showed no restraint. In the deserted mountains, with the sounds of insects and birds, I nervously begged for mercy in a low voice. That day, I realized that all his skills were no match for the brute force without any finesse. My voice was intermittent. "Kevin, the rock is so hard." He didn't stop his movements. "You asked for it." Not only was the stone hard. Everywhere was hard. Only the corner of my heart was soft. That day, I coaxed Kevin pleasingly, saying I would never leave. Kevin believed it. But little did I know, soon after, I would have to break that promise. Chapter 13. George knew the day Julie's grandmother passed away. He stayed at the hospital for a long time. He inquired with the medical staff about the details of that day. The more he listened, the tighter his brow furrowed. When he heard someone mention Julie seemed to have been carried away from the hospital by a man with a scarred corner of his eye, his face darkened to the extreme. Michelle muttered. Even when the whole family dies, she doesn't forget to flirt around. George's emotions suddenly erupted in that moment. He punched the wall behind Michelle, making her shut up and leave. Michelle was dumbfounded. Even George himself couldn't believe it. After all, she was the stepsister he couldn't be with due to ethics. Initially, to get back at his stepmother, he had flirted and played with his innocent stepsister in secret. He thought his indebtedness to her would allow him to tolerate anything she did. But he still drove her away with his scolding. A mix of indescribable emotions troubled him. He knew that the man with the scarred eye was probably the one who placed the bet for Julie that night. He was certain that Julie must have sent him to provoke him. But that man's gaze was like that of a wild dog, and Julie, that foolish girl, shouldn't have acted recklessly. George began frantically looking for someone. He was determined to teach her a lesson. The second-generation members in the circle teased George. "George, didn't you just call him a mangy dog? Why are you so obsessed with finding a dog?" George pursed his lips into a straight line. "A well-trained dog, just obedient." So, someone else wanted to stir up trouble again. The powerful second-generation members reactivated the brand established by Julie's father. They recruited professional managers. Chapter 14. When I saw that message, I knew it was a trap. They dug the hole, waiting for me to jump in. But what they didn't know was that I was planning to get involved in my father's industry before his bankruptcy. Just when I was worried I wouldn't get a chance, they handed me an opportunity on a silver platter. The position of professional manager was mine for the taking. When Kevin found out I was leaving, he sat in the yard smoking all night. When he came back, he buried his head in my neck. His voice was muffled. "Do you have to go?" I remained silent. "They will bully you," he said. I soothingly rubbed his head. "Don't worry, I'm capable. Once I become the manager, I'll come back to protect you." Kevin didn't say anything more. But starting the next day, he no longer sulked while fixing cars. He started coming and going early, returning every night exhausted. One day, he even had a severe scratch on his forehead. When I asked, he said nothing. Sometimes at night, I would wake up to find him sitting in the yard drinking alone. At that time, I didn't know what kind of torment he was going through. All I could do was comfort him repeatedly, assuring him that I would return here sooner or later. Chapter 15. The day of the manager election arrived quickly. I woke up early to prepare, but there was no sign of Kevin. His motorcycle was left in the yard, and his phone message only had 2 words for me. "Don't be afraid." I thought, perhaps he was still mad at me. Suppressing my disappointment, I left alone. The second-generation members whom I had forced to bow down had put a lot of effort into this job competition. They changed the competition dynamics. Placed the assessment in the banquet hall and let the candidates dress up. They claimed it was to see the candidates' social skills. However, the location of the banquet turned out to be the same hall where my father held his memorial service. The candidates had exaggerated large numbers pinned to their clothes. It was a blatant trap, but I braved it nonetheless. Regardless of their intentions, as long as they read my job application, they would see that my father's brand was still profitable. By then, the businessmen would make the right choices. Chapter 16. Before the banquet, I conducted a detailed investigation into the revitalized brand my father left behind. Within a short period, there were multiple changes in ownership, and on the eve of the job competition, controlling ownership transferred again without any public announcement. When I arrived at the banquet hall, the main figures had yet to make an appearance. Anxiously, I once again encountered George. He was seated near the main position. It seemed like he held a significant amount of shares. He watched me from afar, fingers tracing the rim of a glass, his expression inscrutable. The second-generation members began to arrive one after another. "Well, isn't this Julie? You really dare to show up." He greeted the people behind him. "Hey, guys, come on. In consideration of our old friendship, let's interview Julie first, shall we?" The responses were continuous. The leader stared at the number tag on my waist. "Now. Number 2, please listen carefully. The first question in the interview is to bow and apologize to the customer in a low-cut dress, testing the manager's ability to be flexible. Now, treat us as customers, lower your neckline, and start bowing." I stared intently at the screen, enduring a little more, and my job interview video would soon play. However, I overestimated the limits of these second-generation members. In front of everyone, they dared to lay hands on me. What's this? Not willing to bow down? Today, I'll help you bend a little. As he spoke, he was about to touch my head. I dodged, and then, the person beside me, when touched by me, dramatically spilled the entire glass of wine on my chest. "Oh, why are you so clumsy?" It was Michelle who spoke. She stood arrogantly by the side of the second-generation group. A group of people with twisted and malicious faces. It was at that moment that George walked over. He pushed through the crowd, standing in front of me. Looking down at my disheveled state, he remained silent for a while. I knew he was waiting for me to beg him. But how can I fulfill his wish? On the screen, my job interview video had already begun playing. Seeing my lack of response, George smirked. "What's wrong? Everyone is here, and you still can't humble yourself?" A few people near the main position gradually became engrossed in the video content. With a furrowed brow, George deliberately lowered his voice. "Julie, think carefully. Are you going to humble yourself to me alone, or to this group of people? It's been so long, haven't you suffered enough?" The people watching the video began to whisper quietly, nodding in agreement. I met George's gaze and raised an eyebrow mockingly at him. Laughter and heckling erupted around us. Didn't George say that a well-fed dog wouldn't bite its owner? Why is he still trying to bite now? George's calm demeanor finally cracked. Visible anger flashed in his eyes as he gritted his teeth and approached me menacingly. "Julie, are you counting on that waiter to bail you out? That hoodlum you hired for a couple of $100, even if he shows up today, what can he do? Just another person to witness your embarrassment." I never knew that the once refined George could have such a despicable side. It truly proves that saying, when you succeed, the whole world smiles at you. When you fail, the whole world bares its fangs at you. Disgusted, I turned away, feeling regret for the wasted years. George, feeling humiliated, forced me to lock eyes with him. "But Julie, you have no family left, even if you're in a sorry state, no one will be there for you." I sneered inwardly. I'd rather be alone in disgrace. Someone as arrogant as Kevin should always stand his ground. But before George could finish his sentence, the doors of the banquet hall swung open from both sides. A group of elegantly dressed people filed in. Leading them was a familiar figure. Cold, distant eyes, a faint pink scar, with each step, the solid and smooth lines beneath the suit were subtly revealed. Kevin unexpectedly strode towards me in a hurry. Chapter 17. Amidst the bustling crowd of people, I locked eyes with Kevin. "Sorry. I'm late," he said. In that moment, tears uncontrollably welled up in my eyes. When your loved one is absent, disgrace becomes armor, making one even stronger. When I could be stared at with pity, I just wanted to desperately wipe off the wine stains on me and hide all the embarrassment. My actions provoked George. He suddenly grabbed my wrist. Humph, what a tragic love drama. His eyes were bloodshot, flashing with a paranoid light. "Julie, even when acting, one should know when to stop. Don't give chances to those who don't appreciate them." Before he finished speaking, his face was punched crooked. Kevin's speed was astonishing. After throwing a punch, he quickly discarded his suit jacket. By the time George got up, he had already removed his tie and unbuttoned his cufflinks. With his fists and feet moving, another punch was thrown, and George crashed directly onto the dining table, unable to fight back. Dishes were scattered all over the floor, leaving George in a sorry state. As a proud son of heaven, he had never suffered such humiliation before. Surprisingly, none of his followers dared to approach Kevin. Because everyone saw the executive assistant of Sinclair Enterprises following behind Kevin. Sinclair Enterprises stood at the pinnacle like a pyramid, where even an executive assistant was enough to make people fawn over. And that assistant now stood respectfully behind Kevin, picking up his suit, taking his tie. He addressed Kevin as CEO. Kevin said, "Sorry, I'm late." The people who were earnestly watching the job interview video in front of the screen stood up respectfully and said, "You're not late, just in time." Struggling to stand up, George shouted hysterically, "Damn it, this is madness. Julie, do you think you've dressed him up and now he's really made it big? Do you know what the consequences are for impersonating someone from the Sinclair family?" Nervously, I looked at Kevin. But Kevin just smiled at me, his mouth curved, revealing a row of white, handsome teeth. "Julie, thanks to your blessing, I've really hit the jackpot. Now, there's an opportunity to bully others, do you want in? Same place, same people. Fate is like a cycle. Once again, it enveloped us." Chapter 18. Kevin is the prodigal son who left the Sinclair family. Not long ago, he had just bowed down to his father, taking over the company's affairs. And the brand of his father was the first project he acquired after taking over. Just now, he had once again obtained absolute control of this company from his father. George lunged at Kevin several times, but each time he was kicked back by Kevin. No one dared to respond. So he made a call to the police. He laughed absurdly, saying everyone had gone mad, someone was impersonating the eldest son of the Sinclair family, deceiving everyone. He asked the police to come and arrest the person quickly. Kevin no longer paid attention to the man lying on the ground. He turned around and used his suit to cover my embarrassment. The hidden pain in his eyes was well concealed, and he smiled warmly, saying softly, "I knew you were amazing. Many people voted for you in the job interview report. I didn't come because they already knew the pros and cons. And I didn't tell you before because I wanted to be your hero. Are you mad at me?" There was a cautiousness in Kevin's smile, so different from the fierce punches he had thrown. I tightened my coat, recalling Kevin's recent actions. Was there anything unclear at the moment? Rumors had it that the eldest son of the Sinclair family chose to give up his inheritance and leave home because his father had an affair, which led to his mother's death from depression. After Kevin's father's repeated failed attempts to persuade him, he finally brought the mistress and illegitimate child back to the Sinclair family to inherit the family business. Many years had passed, and the illegitimate son of the Sinclair family had already firmly established himself in Sinclair Enterprises. Sinclair Enterprises no longer had a place for Kevin. I remembered the nights when Kevin drank alone. His forehead had scratches, and the hand holding the cigarette trembled imperceptibly. In places I didn't know, how did he bow down to his father? Was it his father who caused the scratches on his forehead? How did this proud man swallow his disgust and speak softly to the one who betrayed his mother? I knew clearly that he kept things from me because he wasn't sure. The control of the brand changed hands last night. And only this morning did Kevin finally take full control of the company from his father, hastening to my rescue just before I was humiliated. Yet, he had to take care of my self-esteem delicately. I knew that even if those people watched my job interview video, they wouldn't have chosen me without hesitation. It was Kevin who made them make the final decision. I couldn't help but hug Kevin. Burying my head in his chest, I mumbled, "Why blame yourself? Blame your newfound wealth? Is it because you're rich now that you can make me bully others? What's wrong with that?" Kevin's tense body relaxed. Like the settling of dust, he reached out and embraced me in return. George, who had finished the call, finally lost control at this moment. He stood up abruptly and grabbed my hand. "Enough, Julie. Don't pretend to be angry at me. It was just a bet, right? Kevin held me in his arms, his warning gaze fixed on George. George's eyes gradually turned mad. Julie, you would rather bow to strangers than to me. What am I to you? I was just playing a little bet, but you. You left half a box of chocolates in my fridge and you're already cozying up to someone else? I looked up at Kevin. Can you really bully others just because you have power? Kevin nodded. I raised my hand and slapped George across the face. Not satisfied, I slapped the other side too. Afterwards, I turned to look at Kevin, and he immediately understood my intention, nodding again. I picked up the wine bottle and poured it over Michelle's head. Before the police arrived, I needed to settle scores and grievances. When the police arrived, they took away George and Michelle. Kevin provided evidence of their harassment towards me, and they were all taken to the police station for questioning. In the end, I got the position of manager. When the assistant asked Kevin if he wanted to hold a banquet to celebrate, Kevin declined. He cancelled all the arrangements and turned to me. Shall we go home? Okay, let's go home. Chapter 19. Kevin drove the car swiftly. When the car stopped at the entrance of our small courtyard, he leaned over to kiss me. His hands were shaking. His voice was trembling too. He said he was so scared that if he had arrived a moment later, they would have bullied me. I responded warmly to him. You look so handsome in a suit. The fabric of this outfit, the contours inside make people want to imagine. Kevin stopped his movements. He cupped my face, gazing deeply into my eyes. Julie, are you scared too? If you're scared, you can tell me. You can be vulnerable, you can cry, you can be spoiled. You don't need to pretend to be indifferent all the time. His serious expression hit me in a second. Tears fell down my face uncontrollably. I buried my face in his neck, letting out all the grievances and fears freely. For the first time since my father and grandmother left, I felt like a child, expressing all my sadness. I was carried upstairs by Kevin. He opened the door with one hand and then gently kissed my eyes. As he became emotional, the scar at the corner of his eye began to darken, right on the crease of his eyelid, a vivid red, incredibly enticing. In a daze, certain dormant memories suddenly awakened. Chapter 20. When I was young, I knew a boy. He was a neighbor from my grandmother's hometown, and whenever I went to my grandmother's house for summer vacation, I would go find him. He took me to the fields. We caught fish, waded in water, and picked wild fruits to eat. On summer afternoons, we would sneak out to play while the old folks napped. I had countless mischievous ideas, and he had countless special skills. Whenever we succeeded in our teamwork, we couldn't avoid getting a good beating. Those summer days were so sweet. But I caused trouble that summer. It was another time when the old folks were napping, and we were huddled together, each holding half a watermelon, eating and watching Journey to the West. When we saw Sun Wukong's fiery eyes, my mischievous idea came out again at the wrong time. I said, "Brother, do you want to be Sun Wukong? The one with fiery eyes?" The boy set down the watermelon, blinked. "If you become Sun Wukong, will you be my Xixia fairy?" I had never heard of a Xixia fairy, it wasn't in A Journey to the West. "I'll be the Xixia fairy, and you can be Sun Wukong?" The boy nodded. So we found some glow-in-the-dark nail polish and applied it to his eyelids. He said his eyes felt a little sore. I told him to endure it, that when it got dark, the nail polish would glow, and he would have fiery eyes. After enduring for a while, his upper and lower eyelids stuck together. He said we should wipe it off with water. So I brought some hot water. Boiling hot water from the thermos. That day, when I forced his eyes open, I cried in fear. His eyes were bloodshot, and his eyelids were bleeding. My crying woke my grandmother up, and she took him to the hospital. When we got to the hospital, that kid still covered his eyes and wouldn't let the doctor treat him. He said it was almost dark and didn't want to delay practicing his fiery eyes. That boy was Kevin. But back then, his grandma only called him by his nickname. Kevin's eyes were covered. I got a fever from the shock and was brought back to the city by my father overnight. When I asked about Kevin later, my dad just casually said everything was fine, telling me not to worry. Later on, my grandmother was also brought to the city by my father. I never dared to go back to my grandmother's hometown again. Chapter 21. Kevin stopped his movements. Looking at the tears in the corners of my eyes, he asked, "Does it hurt?" I reached out and touched the scar, choking back tears. My great sage equal to heaven, finally riding on the colorful clouds, has come to save me. Chapter 22. After George finished taking notes, he had to accept a fact. Kevin was indeed the runaway young master of the Sinclair family. At that moment, all dignity seemed to fade away. When he realized that Julie would never go to his house again to eat the remaining half-box of chocolates, a deep sense of regret and frustration fiercely struck him. The thoughts of making Julie mature, of no longer being arrogant, of having the belle of the ball submit to him, all seemed extremely ridiculous compared to losing Julie. Michelle and those young lords were still covering for each other, dealing with police inquiries. George suddenly lost control. With a stern face, he asked in a cold voice, "Who suggested taking Michelle to the funeral banquet?" No one answered. Michelle was scared by his sharp gaze, took 2 steps back seeking help, but no one responded. George grabbed someone and pressured them again. Whose idea was it? Someone became irritated. Forget whose idea it was, George, weren't you happy then? Why come looking for trouble now that things have gone wrong? Yeah. If you can't handle it, don't play. You were the one who cursed like a madman and said you wanted to ditch her. Never thought she'd climb up the social ladder. One wave subsided, another rose. On the day of the fight at the police station, George was outnumbered, and everyone was injured. It was a reckless way of fighting, and it wasn't until the police drew their guns that they were separated. George was covered in injuries and spent 7 days in the detention center. No red lights, no wine parties, no false pride, and gossip. For the first time, George truly faced his own heart. He loved Julie. Ever since she announced she wanted to pursue him, he had been in a state of panic. But he had been brought up on the art of scheming and power play. He was afraid that whoever loved first would always lose. He held it up. When she didn't come to him for 3 days, and he found out he was not as good as menstrual blood, he was even more convinced of this. But he still fell. Julie's charming and swift temperament made him unable to stop. He thought there would always be a chance. The days were long, there would always be a chance for him to gain the upper hand. So, when Julie's family went bankrupt, and then her father passed away with great affection, his inner feelings were more of relief than sorrow. He despicably anticipated Julie's transformation. Without Julie's father's rule of not staying out overnight, without Julie's powerful background, would Julie willingly take off her dress like Michelle did? The same thing, if Julie did it, would be much more beautiful than Michelle. But in the end, who would have expected it? The waiter Julie casually chose could be the young master of the Sinclair family. Thinking of this, George clutched his chest and hunched over. He thought of their intertwined fingers, and the kiss from that man, like a wild dog, on Julie's forehead. His heart ached. Many beautiful moments from the past flooded his mind all at once. The most painful thing was that he was sure Julie had loved him once. He was also sure Julie no longer loved him now. George felt this was unfair. If the waiter was just a waiter, he would never lose Julie. She couldn't get used to simple food and rough clothes. Thinking of this, George rekindled hope. A major plan took shape in his mind. He would join forces with the illegitimate son of the Sinclair family to bring Kevin back to his original state. Without the luxurious life of Julie, she would come back to him. Chapter 23. Kevin began to take over the affairs of Sinclair Enterprises, and I started my career as a professional manager. We drove out together every morning and still returned to the second floor of the restaurant at night. I didn't inquire how Kevin bowed to his father. I wanted my beloved to always be carefree. But there always seemed to be someone blind to it. I encountered George again downstairs at the company. He stood in front of Kevin, asking lightly, "Can a mechanic's hand handle a signing pen?" Behind him was Tony, Kevin's half-brother with the same father, different mother. Tony smiled as if he was enjoying the spring breeze. George was joking. "You don't know how adaptable your brother is. You see how fierce he usually is. When he kneels in front of my father, he gets scolded so badly that he doesn't dare to make a sound." That day, Kevin didn't make a move. I did. I punched Tony. A pampered boy who didn't know how to fight back, his eyes turned red from a few punches. Kevin leaned on his arm on the side. "Why cry, hold it in. Your mother is gone, your brother's wife is like a mother now. You will be disciplined more when your brother educates you in the future. Bear with it slowly." I didn't have Kevin's good temper. I used all kinds of despicable means. A knee to the chest made him hunch over. I pulled his hair while hitting and scolding him. "Don't make friends with any scumbags trying to please your brother. Your brother can still give you a mouthful of food. If you don't learn to be humble, I'll show you how tough I can be. Manage your foul mouth from now on. If you dare to upset your brother again, I'll beat you to death." Tony couldn't keep up his carefree attitude anymore, covering his crotch, looking at me in fear. "Kevin, take care of your wife." "Ouch, it hurts, be careful, I'll go home and tell Dad."
Ah.
"Help." Kevin walked over with a smile, kicked Tony away, then grabbed my hand and held me in his arms. "Don't be angry, I'm fine." He gently comforted me, stroking my hair. "It's all over, it's only right for a son to kneel before his father. Does your hand hurt?" "It hurts." I shrunk into his embrace. My hand hurt, but my heart hurt more. I knew how much a child loves their mother. His mother was driven to death by his father. At such a young age, he would rather work as a mechanic than return to his father. It's easy to imagine the depth of that hatred. I cried convulsively, wiping tears on Kevin's clothes. Tony grumbled and ran away as if he were fleeing. The bustling square suddenly had employees coming over after work. I nestled in Kevin's arms as if no one else were there, while George stood forlornly on the side. He quietly watched me. In an instant, his eyes turned red. The previous pride was gone, replaced by a look of sorrow and despair. "Julie, do you remember the graduation party? At that time, I was fighting with someone, and you protected me like that. You were so delicate, yet you dared to hold a bottle in front of me." George's voice began to choke up, rare vulnerability exposed in front of others. "I was wrong, Julie, I was wrong. But, won't you give me a chance to make things right? If you truly love me, why not give me a single chance?" He hung his head, leaning against the lamppost, continuing to mutter softly. "The orchids you nurtured on the balcony have bloomed, you said you would call me before they bloom, but now your phone is unreachable. I called all night long, until the orchids withered, and you still didn't answer. Julie, please give me a chance to make amends. As long as you turn back to look at me, you will remember that you love me. You once said you wanted me to accompany you to your grandmother's hometown. I postponed my work, arranged everything, Julie, just turn back, and I will do anything you say." More and more people gathered around, pointing and whispering. "Isn't that CEO George crying? What a pathetic sight. He deserves it, didn't you hear? He was caught gambling at his fiancée's father's funeral. What's there to pity about a man like him?" I lifted my head from Kevin's embrace. Kevin raised an eyebrow, questioning me. "Do you want me to leave?" I glared at him sarcastically, twisting his abs harshly. "Sounds nice, if I leave, how will you be pacified tonight? Besides, he's just a worthless cur, what's the point in me leaving?" Kevin laughed indulgently, clutching his stomach. George's face turned pale. I turned back. Let's forget about the chocolates and flowers, who hasn't made a few mistakes when they were young? I was blind before, I admit it. Just don't keep appearing in front of me. Whenever you show up, it reminds me of my own foolish past. Who knows how I might react? I took Kevin's arm. And I don't need to go to my grandmother's hometown anymore. I found the person I was looking for. George looked at me in disbelief, his expression changing several times. I think, with his convoluted thoughts, this sentence will keep him guessing and pondering for a long time. As for what happened after he learned the truth, leading to him getting hospitalized due to bleeding ulcers, that's a story for another time. Chapter 24. That night, I left holding Kevin's hand. Kevin asked me, "Did you really consider finding me?" I teased him. "Do you want the truth or a lie?" Kevin fell silent. "But I did look for you." "Me, when?" Kevin just stared at me, saying nothing. "Me, come on, tell me, when?" Kevin cleared his throat and spoke with difficulty. "The year you graduated from college." "The school reunion." The school reunion where I stood in front of George. At that moment, my heart was filled with mixed emotions. Some thoughts in my mind gradually became clear. "So, at the funeral, you weren't there to give something?" Kevin remained silent, helping me fasten my seatbelt. "And at the hospital staircase." The hospital staircase, was that not a coincidence? Was it? "Kevin, speak up." Kevin opened the glove compartment in the car and took out a small box. He opened the lid, revealing a beautiful diamond ring he handed to me. "So, will you marry me?" Tears welled up in my eyes, and I couldn't speak for a long time. Kevin said seriously, "The road ahead may not be easy. I am no longer just Kevin the mechanic, but Kevin who is back to fight for inheritance." Wiping away my tears, I smiled through my sobs. "Marry you." "Why not?" "If I don't like someone, I won't marry a mechanic. If I like someone, I will marry even a billionaire." Kevin laughed too. "What kind of logic is that?" Saying this, he leaned down to kiss me. Chapter 25. In our second year of marriage, Kevin's father passed away. In his old age, he remembered his late wife and, out of guilt and recognition of Kevin's abilities, he passed on most of his shares to Kevin. Tony seemed to have learned his lesson from the beating I gave him, and he never dared to mention Kevin's scar while trash-talking again. The following year, our child was born, and as a gift, Kevin gave me a report. More than half of the people who made a scene at the condolence banquet went bankrupt. Although George didn't go bankrupt, he struggled immensely. Kevin kissed my forehead. "After your maternity leave, we'll use his father's brand to acquire him." From outside the door came Tony's exaggerated retching. "Disgusting, they're nauseatingly sweet." Kevin chuckled and asked me, "Did you beat him up again?" "No, he brought gifts for the child. When you were away, he secretly kissed the child several times." Kevin pulled me close, his gaze drifting outside the window. The sunlight outside was just right. And our scars were gradually healing.